investigators had DNA. Real, physical DNA recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. DNA that didn't belong to Nancy, didn't belong to anyone in her family. For weeks, this felt like the break that could crack this case wide open. They submitted it to CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. Over 20 million profiles, convicted criminals, arrested suspects, people already in the system. No match. They tested the gloves found 2 miles from Nancy's home on the side of the road. Gloves that the FBI says appear to match what the suspect was wearing in the surveillance footage. No match there either. For a lot of people following this case, that felt like a gut punch. 2 DNA samples, 0 hits, and an 84-year-old woman still missing. But here's what most people don't understand. A CODIS miss is not a dead end. In fact, for investigators who know what they're doing, it's the beginning of something far more powerful. Because there's a technology that has pulled killers' identities out of thin air, years and even decades after the crime. And investigators in the Nancy Guthrie case are now turning to it. Today, we're breaking all of it down. The DNA, the technology, the cases where it's worked, and why the person who walked up to Nancy Guthrie's front door on February 1st should be very, very worried right now. The CODIS miss reframed as an advantage, not a setback. Promise of the full breakdown plus emotional stakes. Viewer needs to stay to understand why this isn't a dead end. Welcome back to True Crime Buff HQ. Before we get into the DNA and the technology, if you're new to this case or need a refresher, here's where we are. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She's a mother, a grandmother, and by every account from people who know her, she is sharp, independent, and full of life. She lived on her own in Tucson, Arizona. She drove herself places. She had dinner with her daughters regularly. She played games with her grandchildren. She was not frail in spirit. She was living her life on her terms. Her daughter is Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. And while that fact has brought this case national attention, it's also likely what made Nancy a target. But we'll get to that. On the evening of January 31st, Nancy had dinner with family. She was dropped off at her home. A family member walked her inside, made sure she was settled, and left. Nancy was alone. In the early hours of February 1st, her pacemaker disconnected from her iPhone. That's the last digital trace of Nancy Guthrie. What happened between the time her family left and that disconnection is the central mystery of this case. Days later, the FBI recovered surveillance footage from a Nest camera at Nancy's front door. Footage that initially was said not to exist. That footage shows a masked individual approaching Nancy's front door, armed, gloved, carrying a backpack, and that individual has not been identified until potentially now. Until potentially now creates forward momentum. Viewer expects the identification is coming and stays to see it. Let's talk about what happened with the DNA because the headlines made it sound worse than it is. Investigators recovered DNA from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. We don't know exactly what form that DNA took. Was it blood? Touch DNA from a surface? Something left on an object? Law enforcement hasn't specified. What they have said is that the DNA does not belong to Nancy and does not belong to any member of her family. That's significant because it means someone who isn't family left biological material inside that home. Now, does that automatically mean it's the suspect? No, it could be a maintenance worker, a landscaper who came inside to use the bathroom, a guest from weeks prior, Anyone who entered that home in a reasonable time frame could have left trace DNA. And investigators know that. But here's where it gets interesting. Classic rehook to prevent drift during the explanatory section. They also recovered gloves found 2 miles from Nancy's home on the side of the road. The FBI publicly stated that these gloves appear to match what the suspect in the surveillance footage was wearing. That's not language the FBI uses loosely. They didn't say resemble, they said match. And a retired FBI special agent who formerly ran violent crimes task forces in Arizona pointed out that distinction matters. The FBI is meticulous with their word choices in public statements. Now, there's an interesting detail about these gloves. In the surveillance footage, the gloves the suspect is wearing appear to have unusual thickness, like there might be a layer underneath. Maybe a second glove. Maybe an insulated or chemical-resistant lining. If the gloves found on the road share that same unusual thickness, that's a much rarer item than your standard nitrile gloves that millions of people use for cleaning. Both samples, the DNA from inside the home and DNA from the gloves, were submitted to CODIS. That's the FBI's combined DNA index system. Think of it as a national database of DNA profiles, but here's the critical thing most people don't realize. CODIS only contains the profiles of people who have been convicted of crimes or arrested. That's roughly 4 to 6% of the U.S. population. 4 to 6%. So when someone says the DNA didn't hit on CODIS, what they're actually saying is whoever left this DNA has never been arrested or convicted. That eliminates career criminals. But it doesn't eliminate the other 94 to 96% of the country. And that's where genetic genealogy comes in. And this is the part of the story that should make the person who walked up to Nancy Guthrie's front door lose sleep at night. Stakes, escalation, directly addressing the suspect, creates emotional tension and positions the next section as the key to solving the case. Genetic genealogy, sometimes called forensic genetic genealogy, is one of the most significant breakthroughs in criminal investigation in the last decade. And the Pima County Sheriff has confirmed that investigators will be turning to this technology in the Nancy Guthrie case. Here's how it works, step by step. Because understanding this process is essential to understanding where this investigation is heading. Step 1. You have an unknown DNA sample from a crime scene. In this case, it's whatever was recovered from inside Nancy's home. That sample goes into CODIS first. If there's a direct match, case solved. But when there's no hit, which is the majority of the time since CODIS only covers a small fraction of the population, investigators move to step 2. Step 2, that same DNA sample gets submitted to private genetic databases. Companies like GED Match, Family Tree DNA, platforms where ordinary people voluntarily submit their DNA to trace their ancestry, find distant relatives, build family trees. Thousands of people have uploaded their genetic profiles to these databases. And here's the key. Law enforcement doesn't need a warrant to access them because the data was submitted voluntarily by private citizens. Step 3, the system looks for genetic matches. Now, it almost never matches directly to the suspect. What it does is find relatives, could be a parent, could be a sibling, could be a second cousin, a third cousin, even a fourth cousin. The DNA doesn't need to be an exact match. It just needs to share enough genetic markers to establish a familial connection. Step 4. Once investigators have a relative, even a distant one, they start building a family tree. They work outward from that known relative, mapping every branch, every connection. Somewhere in that tree is the person whose DNA was at the crime scene. Step 5. Investigators narrow the list. Who in this family tree lives in the right geographic area? Who matches the physical description? Who had access or opportunity? They cross-reference the family tree against what they know about the crime, and they start eliminating people until they have a manageable suspect list. Step 6. Confirmation. Once they've identified a likely suspect, they need to confirm. And this is where it gets clever. They follow the suspect. They wait for them to discard something with their DNA on it. A coffee cup at a restaurant, a water bottle at an airport, a cigarette butt. They collect that item, test the DNA, and compare it to the crime scene sample. If it matches, they have their person. This process is not instant. Depending on how close the initial genetic match is, it can take anywhere from a couple of weeks to over a year. A close family match, like a parent or sibling, means a smaller family tree to build. A fourth cousin means dozens or even hundreds of people to work through. But with the resources on this case, hundreds of FBI agents, the full attention of federal law enforcement, a retired FBI agent who has used this technology says it could take as little as a week. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Does this actually work? Can you really pull someone's identity out of a family tree and a discarded water bottle? Let me show you exactly how it works. Because there's a case that mirrors the Nancy Guthrie investigation in ways that are almost eerie. Transition to the Maryland case. Mirrors the Nancy Guthrie investigation and almost eerie create strong curiosity pull into the next section. Chevy Chase, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. The year is 2001. A woman named Leslie Prier is found beaten to death inside her home. The violence is extreme. It's clear she fought for her life because male DNA is found under her fingernails. She scratched her attacker. She drew his blood. She gave investigators the evidence they would need to find her killer. But not yet. Because in 2001, DNA technology could tell you a lot about the sample. But it couldn't tell you who it belonged to unless that person was already in the system. And this person wasn't. The DNA went into CODIS. No match. The case went cold. For 24 years. 24 years. An entire generation. Leslie Prier's family lived without answers for nearly a quarter century. The DNA sat in evidence, preserved, waiting for technology to catch up. And it did. But not yet. And for 24 years, create deliberate pauses that build emotional weight before the breakthrough. When forensic genetic genealogy became available to law enforcement, investigators in Maryland took that male DNA from under Leslie's fingernails and submitted it to private genetic databases. They got a hit, not on the killer directly, but on a relative, a man living in Romania, a distant cousin. From that single match, they built outward, branch by branch, name by name, and a name surfaced that should have been investigated decades earlier, Eugene Glegor. A neighbor had actually mentioned Glegor's name to investigators back in 2001 as someone they should look into. For reasons that have never been explained, law enforcement didn't follow up on that lead. It took the science getting better for them to circle back to the name that had been sitting in the case file the entire time. investigators identified Eugene Glegor and put him under surveillance. They followed him to an airport. And when Glegor threw away a water bottle without knowing he was being watched, they grabbed it. They tested the DNA from that water bottle against the sample taken from under Leslie Prier's fingernails 24 years earlier. It was a match. Eugene Glegor was taken into custody. And what followed was one of the most striking interrogation videos you'll see in any true crime case. Glegor was Leslie Prier's daughter's boyfriend at the time of the murder. He had been in and around that house. He knew the victim personally. And for 24 years, he walked free because his DNA wasn't in any criminal database. During the interrogation, detectives laid out the genetic genealogy process. They explained how the DNA from the crime scene led to a relative in Romania, how that connection built outward to him. Glegor's response was to ask for a lawyer. When a detective noted that Glegor appeared to be performing emotions rather than genuinely feeling them, pointing out the absence of actual tears, Glegor's composure cracked. He became agitated, defensive. He called the observation outrageous, but the DNA didn't lie. And when confronted with the fact that his genetic material was found at the crime scene, Glegor's options evaporated. Eugene Glegor pleaded guilty to the 2001 murder of Leslie Prier. He is currently serving 22 years in prison. Now, I want to be clear about why I'm telling you this story. It's not just because it's a compelling case. It's because the parallels to the Nancy Guthrie investigation are striking. In both cases, you have DNA recovered from a home where a crime occurred. In both cases, the DNA didn't match anyone in CODIS. In both cases, the DNA belongs to someone who was never arrested or convicted of a crime. And in both cases, genetic genealogy became the next investigative step. The Leslie Prier case took 24 years. The Nancy Guthrie case has had access to this technology from day one. With the FBI's resources, with the volume of agents working this case, with the urgency of a missing person who may still be alive, the timeline should be dramatically compressed. And the Prier case isn't the only proof of concept. Brian Kohberger, the man who murdered 4 University of Idaho students inside their home in November 2022. Kohberger left a knife sheath on the bed of one of the victims. There was DNA on that sheath. And investigators used genetic genealogy to link that sheath to Kohberger through a family connection, just like the Prier case. Kohberger was arrested weeks later. The technology works. The question in the Nancy Guthrie case is, what kind of DNA do investigators have, and how directly does it connect to the person on the surveillance footage? Because that's the critical variable. If the DNA recovered from inside Nancy's home came from something the suspect touched during the crime, that's a direct link. If it's touch DNA from a doorknob that could have been left by anyone at any time, investigators might be chasing a dead end that has nothing to do with the suspect at all. And this is something that a retired FBI special agent recently addressed directly, saying that investigators are likely looking for DNA connected to specific areas of the home where the suspect would have been that night. Not just random touch DNA from surfaces anyone could have contacted. We don't know what they have. But the sheriff's confidence in turning to genetic genealogy suggests they believe this DNA is worth pursuing. And that's telling. There's another dimension to this that most coverage has missed. Even if the DNA from inside the house turns out to belong to someone unrelated to the crime, investigators still have the gloves. Those gloves were found discarded. And if there's DNA inside those gloves, that's almost certainly from the person who wore them. You don't get someone else's DNA inside a pair of gloves. The interior surface of a glove is one of the most personal pieces of evidence you can find. So even if the house DNA leads nowhere, the glove DNA could be the breakthrough. And that DNA is also now eligible for genetic genealogy testing. The point is, investigators don't have one shot at this. They have multiple DNA samples from multiple locations. Each one is an independent pathway to identification, and genetic genealogy can be applied to all of them. But genetic genealogy isn't the only thread investigators are pulling. And this is the part of the case that I think gets lost in the daily news cycle, because when you step back and look at everything that's happening simultaneously, the net around this suspect is tightening from multiple directions at once. The net around this suspect is tightening from multiple directions at once, promises a comprehensive breakdown. Viewer stays to see all the threads. The backpack the suspect is carrying in the surveillance footage has been identified as a product sold exclusively at Walmart. Not available at any other retailer. That's a massive investigative advantage. Investigators are now working directly with Walmart to trace purchases of that specific backpack. The sheriff indicated the purchase window could be anywhere from 20 to 60 days before the crime. But it's not just the backpack. The clothing the suspect is wearing may also be Walmart purchases. The mask is potentially a Walmart item. And think about the climate in Tucson, Arizona. How many people are walking into a Walmart in the Tucson area and buying a full face mask like the one in the surveillance video? That's not a common purchase in the desert. If Walmart's transaction records show someone buying a backpack, a mask, gloves, and specific clothing items in a single trip, or even across multiple trips in a narrow time frame, that's a trail that leads to a name and a face. Walmart's surveillance systems are extensive. Nearly every square foot of a Walmart store is covered by cameras. If investigators can narrow down the purchase to a specific store and time frame, they have the buyer on camera with their face uncovered, paying with a method that likely ties to their identity. And consider this. Walmart retains transaction data and video footage for extended periods. Loyalty programs, credit card records, even the specific register and time of purchase can be cross-referenced with in-store camera footage. If the suspect used a debit card, a credit card, or even a loyalty account, the purchase leads directly to an identity. If they paid cash, the camera still captured their face. Either way, the Walmart trail is one of the most concrete and actionable leads in this entire investigation. This is a detail that hasn't gotten enough attention. The FBI has been visiting gun stores in the Tucson area with a list of dozens of people and photographs, asking store owners if any of those individuals had been in the store in the last year. A gun store owner who spoke to the media said that many of the people on the list had facial hair, consistent with what we can see in the surveillance footage. Now, we don't know who's on that list or why. We don't know if these are known associates, people flagged through other investigative channels, or individuals identified through tips. But the FBI doesn't canvass gun stores with a list of dozens of faces on a hunch. They have a reason for every name on that list. And the 1-year time frame suggests they're looking at more than just recent activity. They're looking at preparation. The suspect in the surveillance footage has a gun holster on his waist. It appears to be an inexpensive universal fit holster, the kind you can buy at Walmart or sporting goods stores. But the gun itself had to come from somewhere. And if the suspect purchased a firearm in Arizona in the last year, there's a paper trail, there's a Form 4473, there's a background check, there's a record. There's also a detail the sheriff mentioned that hasn't gotten much public analysis. The suspect may be wearing a ring in the surveillance footage. A ring is one of the most personally identifying items a person can wear. If investigators can determine what kind of ring it is, whether it's a wedding band, a class ring, a signet ring, or something distinctive that narrows the field significantly. It's the kind of detail that someone who recognizes the suspect might notice and connect to a specific person. Each evidence thread builds on the last. The cumulative effect creates a sense of inevitability that the suspect will be identified. This is where the investigation gets into territory that sounds almost like science fiction. The sheriff has confirmed that investigators are using what is conversationally called a signal sniffer. It's technology that can be mounted on a drone or a helicopter, flown low and slow over a targeted area, and it scans for electronic signals on the ground. Cell phones, Bluetooth devices, medical devices like pacemakers. Nancy Guthrie had a pacemaker. That pacemaker was connected to her iPhone. The last time it communicated with her phone was in the early hours of February 1st. Now, pacemakers don't just stop working because a phone disconnects. The device itself continues to emit signals. If Nancy's pacemaker is still functioning, even if she's no longer alive, that signal could theoretically be detected by this technology. It's a long shot, but investigators are working with the pacemaker manufacturer to understand exactly what signals the device emits and how they can be tracked. And then there's the tech industry involvement. The sheriff says that Meta and Apple have both reached out to offer assistance. We don't know the specifics of what they're providing, but consider the possibilities. Apple controls the ecosystem that Nancy's pacemaker was connected to. They have data on when and where that connection was active. Meta operates platforms that the suspect may have used to communicate, plan, or research. If either company has data that can put a specific person in a specific place at a specific time, that's another thread pulling the net tighter. Law enforcement continues to return to Nancy's home. The sheriff hasn't specified what they're looking for at this point, but the fact that they keep going back suggests there's something in or around that property that hasn't been fully processed, or they're looking for something new based on information they've developed. We also know there was a SWAT raid on a home within miles of Nancy's residence. At least one person was detained and later released. A federally approved search warrant was executed. The sheriff says they continue to analyze what was taken from that home. He also said the public should expect more operations like that one. That's not the language of investigators who are stuck. That's the language of investigators who have leads they're actively running down. The $100,000 FBI reward remains active. Thousands of tips continue to come in, and the sheriff was emphatic. This case is not cold. Summary beat before the motive section. Viewer has absorbed the evidence threads and is now primed for the why question. So we've covered the DNA. We've covered the technology. We've covered the physical evidence. But there's a question that runs underneath all of it, and it's the question that the Pima County Sheriff addressed directly in his most recent round of interviews. Why Nancy? The sheriff used the word targeted. He said he believes the person who appeared on the surveillance footage at Nancy's front door had a target in mind. He described this as a hunch, but the sheriff is not a man given to wild speculation in front of cameras. When he says targeted, he's basing that on something. Now, earlier in the investigation, a local television station in Phoenix reported that the working theory was that this started as a burglary and escalated into a kidnapping. Law enforcement appeared to push back on that characterization. And when you hear what a retired FBI special agent had to say about the motive, the picture gets more complicated and more troubling. The agent laid out something that I think is critically important. Targeted doesn't necessarily mean what most people assume. Targeted could mean this person knew Nancy personally and had a specific grievance. But it could also mean something less personal and equally dangerous. Someone who works in homes, a maintenance worker, a landscaper, a contractor, was inside Nancy's house at some point and noticed that an elderly woman lived alone and appeared to have money. That worker tells someone. That someone decides to act. That's targeted, but it's targeted based on opportunity and perceived vulnerability, not personal connection. The targeted doesn't mean what you think. Reframe challenges viewer assumptions, creates a new lens to view all the evidence through. Now let's talk about what this probably isn't. Multiple experts and analysts have expressed skepticism that this is a traditional kidnapping. The reasons are compelling. In a financially motivated kidnapping, the first communication comes fast, immediately. The kidnapper contacts the family while panic and chaos are at their peak. That's how they extract money. It's the same psychology scammers use. Urgency, fear, no time to think. You call the family, you demand payment. You prove you have the person, and you get your money before anyone has time to involve law enforcement. In this case, the first financial demand reportedly came days later. Days. No professional kidnapper holds an 84-year-old victim with health issues and a need for medication for multiple days before making contact. The risk is too high. The liability is too great. And the practical challenges of caring for an elderly, medically fragile person are enormous. This does not follow any established pattern of financially motivated kidnapping. An ideological motivation doesn't fit either. There's been no public statement, no manifesto, no letters to media outlets, no cause being championed. Ideological kidnappers want attention. They want their message broadcast. We've seen none of that. What the retired FBI agent suggested, and what I think deserves serious consideration, is the possibility that this was a crime with a different original intent. Possibly burglary, possibly something else, and that something went wrong inside that house. Nancy may have been hurt. Blood was visible on the door. The suspect panicked, and what followed was an attempt to conceal what had already happened, rather than execute a planned kidnapping. There's also a theory that the suspect's motivation could be rooted in a perceived grievance, possibly even a delusional one. Mental illness doesn't follow rational patterns. If the suspect believed, whether rightly or wrongly, that Nancy or someone connected to that household was responsible for something that happened to them, that belief doesn't need to make sense to anyone else. It just needs to make sense to them. And then there's the question of Mexico. The sheriff addressed speculation that the suspect may have crossed the border into Nogales. He pushed back on this theory. The retired FBI agent agreed, noting that nothing about the surveillance footage suggests organized cross-border crime. The suspect's approach doesn't look professional. The decision-making at the door, grabbing at the bush, being surprised by the camera, removing the doorbell. These are not the actions of someone connected to sophisticated criminal networks. The sophistication analysis transitions naturally into the next section about the suspect's behavior. There's a fascinating contradiction at the center of this case. The suspect took some steps that show planning. The mask, the gloves, the gun. Arriving in the early hours of the morning when the neighborhood would be quiet. Targeting the security camera. These are premeditated decisions, but the execution reveals gaps. The surprise at the doorbell camera, grabbing the bush to hide his face, an impulsive decision. Removing the camera, which actually preserved the footage rather than destroying it. The gloves being discarded 2 miles away, in a location where they could be found. The potential failure to fully prevent DNA from being left inside the home. As the retired FBI agent put it, sometimes suspects aren't smart. They're just lucky. For a period of time. And the more investigative tools that are brought to bear on this case, from genetic genealogy to Walmart, purchase records, to signal sniffers, to tech company cooperation, the more that luck runs out. There's also the question of early investigative missteps that may have given the suspect additional time. The sheriff himself has acknowledged that the crime scene was turned over too quickly. In hindsight, holding the scene longer might have yielded additional physical evidence. A retired FBI agent agreed, noting that while there was no pressure to release the scene, it was returned relatively fast. Would holding it longer have produced a breakthrough? We can't know. But it's a reminder that in investigations like this, every hour at the scene matters, and decisions made in the first 48 hours can echo through the entire case. And there's the Nest camera footage situation. Initially, the footage was reported not to exist. It took the FBI's intervention to recover it. Those lost days between the crime and the footage recovery may have given the suspect a window to dispose of evidence, establish alibis, or even leave the area. How different would this investigation look if that footage had been available on day one? We'll never know. But it's another factor that has made this case harder than it needed to be. Every day that passes without an arrest feels like failure from the outside. But from the inside of an investigation like this, every day is another lead processed, another name checked, another branch of the family tree explored. The sheriff acknowledged that this phase is a slog, that after covering hundreds of tips that don't lead anywhere, human nature makes it hard to stay sharp on the next one. But he also said the resources haven't diminished, and the commitment hasn't wavered. 400 FBI agents, federal search warrants, genetic genealogy in motion, corporate tech giants cooperating, drone-mounted signal detection, and a $100,000 reward that means every person in the Tucson area has a financial incentive to remember what they saw. Whoever walked up to Nancy Guthrie's front door thought they could disappear. They thought a mask and gloves were enough. They thought that if their DNA wasn't in a criminal database, it wouldn't matter. They were wrong. I want to end where we should always end when covering a case like this, with Nancy. It's easy to get lost in the DNA, the technology, the theories, the surveillance footage. The investigation becomes a puzzle, and puzzles are intellectually satisfying to work through. But at the center of this puzzle is a person, an 84-year-old woman who was in her home, who had just come from dinner with her family, who had no idea that the life she'd built, the independence she'd maintained, the safety she'd always felt in her own house, was about to be shattered. We talk about cases. Investigators talk about evidence. The media talks about developments. But Nancy Guthrie isn't a case. She's a mother who called her daughters regularly. She's a grandmother who played games with her grandchildren. She's a woman who, at 84, was still living life on her own terms, still driving, still independent, still sharp. And she's still missing. If you're watching this from the Tucson area, and you saw anything unusual in late January or early February, anything at all, a vehicle you didn't recognize, a person who seemed out of place, unusual activity near Nancy's neighborhood or along the route where those gloves were found, please contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department at 5203-514900 or contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or tips.fbi.gov. You might not think what you saw matters, but one tip from one person has cracked cases far older and far colder than this one. The technology is there, the resources are there, the investigators are there. Sometimes all that's missing is the one person who saw something and decided to make the call. To the Guthrie family, we haven't stopped paying attention, and we won't. To Nancy, people are looking for you, hundreds of them, every single day. And to whoever did this, the science doesn't forget. The DNA doesn't expire. And the family tree goes back a lot further than you think. If this breakdown helped you understand where this investigation is actually heading, hit subscribe. We cover cases like this with the depth they deserve. Not just the daily headlines, but the forensics, the investigation, the evidence that actually matters. Drop a comment below. Do you think genetic genealogy will be the thing that cracks this case? I read every comment and I want to hear your take. If you haven't seen our full evidence breakdown of the Nancy Guthrie case, that video is linked right here. It covers the 30 clues the suspect left behind, and everything we discussed today builds directly on that foundation. Share this video. The more people who understand how this technology works, the more public pressure stays on this case. And public pressure is what keeps the resources flowing. This is True Crime Buff HQ, and we don't give up on the missing.